Well, thank you all for inviting me. This is, in my view, a lot more productive than a lot of other things that I could be doing on Sunday evening. I hope it's a little more productive than what you might be doing. I've been giving lectures by Zoom for the last 10 months, and it's definitely much harder than in person if you can't feed off the audience and have some interaction. But I will say there's one advantage for me, however, and that is that people can't boo except through the chat. So if you want to boo, I'll have to tell you that you can do it through the chat. And despite the hardship of the pandemic, there is one nice thing, and that is we can all go to church in our underwear. So let's dig into this a little bit. The name of my talk tonight is Our Environmental Crisis is in fact a Morality Crisis. Taking a cue from the ubiquitous and obnoxious drug company ads that we all see, rather than ask your doctor if the latest outrageously expensive drug is right for you, ask them if clean air is right for you. And if he or she doesn't have much of an answer, then I want you to be able to educate them with everything that you learned tonight. And let me begin on that front by sharing with you my favorite air pollution study. PAHs is the acronym for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're a very toxic group of chemicals with multiple benzene rings. Among the many ways you might get exposed to PAHs is through barbecuing. Now, I'm going to apologize right now to any of you that love barbecuing. And by the way, I'm going to undoubtedly offend a lot of you, and I'm very good at that, I'm told. In fact, when I'm done, if you feel I left out that I haven't offended you, put that in the chat and I'll try and offend you personally. Now, researchers wanted to find out how people got exposed to PAHs at a barbecue. And what they found out was rather interesting. The number one route of PAH exposure was eating the food cooked over the grill. But the second most important route of exposure was through skin absorption. In fact, their clothes became so saturated with PAHs such that they actually recommended that if you're going to go to a barbecue, you should go change your clothes immediately afterwards to stop absorbing PAHs through your skin from your clothes. But this is my own recommendation based on that study. Never go to a barbecue naked. See, I've already offended more people already. Now, actually, my real recommendation is forget barbecues altogether because they're really not good for you. And that segues nicely into a very brief discussion about the physiology behind how air pollution affects public health, because it's basically endogenous or interior barbecuing. It creates an inflammatory response that you might liken to a slow burn that affects all the blood vessels and all the critical organs. On a macro scale, air pollution is the number one environmental cause of human deaths and contributes to 4 of the 5 leading causes of death and is responsible for about 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. Now, we'll talk more shortly about how air pollution changes how your body looks under the microscope. But before we dig into that a little further, I want to talk about 8 principles that are not factored into government regulation, not well understood by even public health departments, never addressed by lawmakers, and are little known to the public. And the first principle is there is no safe level of air pollution. Now, this principle was established very well by research about 10 years ago by some of the world's most well-respected researchers, one of whom is Dr. Arden Pope at Brigham Young University. These researchers plotted on the x-axis going to the right, increasing concentrations of 3 different types of air pollution. One was cigarette smoke firsthand, another was cigarette smoke secondhand, and the third was community air pollution. And on the y-axis going up was the signature outcome of air pollution exposure, which is a sudden death. And these researchers found, in fact, that as you can see there, as soon as you get any air pollution exposure at all, you are in fact getting public health consequences, increase in the number of sudden death. Now, this is further embellished by the fact that other studies show this same sort of hyperbolic relationship, and that is smoking one cigarette a day is actually almost half as much risk as smoking an entire pack. Other things about which we know there is no safe level of exposure. There's no safe level of lead exposure, as confirmed by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the CDC. There's no safe amount of exposure to the Hallmark Channel, which is what my wife is watching right now. There's also no safe amount of Rudy Giuliani's famous hair dye. There's no safe number of snakes on a plane. And there's no safe amount of reality that we can deny. Now, back to what we were talking about. There's no safe level of air pollution. Let me illustrate that further by coloring in some of that graph. At the very low doses of air pollution, let's say that's that green box, you can see that in fact, most of the mortality consequences are happening in that green box. And that is confirmed by other studies that show, in fact, 99%, one study showed 99% of the mortality related to air pollution is actually in communities that meet the EPA's standard. Now, the EPA standards might be likened to that thin white line that outlines that yellow box. You can see, however, if we meet the EPA standards, we're still having substantial health consequences. And then in fact, if we go far beyond that, if we get into Beijing, China levels of air pollution, yes, we have increased the consequences. We have increased the mortality, but not by as much as you would think. So the point there is not that it's okay for us to have more polluted air, but the point is all air pollution matters and there is no safe level. Second principle is that virtually everyone's affected. Whether they have symptoms or not, whether their pre-existing health is good or not, whether they're young, whether they're old, virtually everyone is affected. And in fact, we know that the average person who experiences a lifelong level of air pollution comparable to what we experience on the Wasatch Front probably loses about 2 years of their life expectancy due to our air pollution, even if they never have symptoms, and even if their eventual cause of death cannot be directly attributed to air pollution. We also know there are important social and genetic differences in susceptibility to air pollution. Two people can be sitting side by side for 70 long years and be exposed to the same level of air pollution and have significantly different health outcomes because of their genetic differences. That is also true of social differences. We know that minorities are more adversely affected. And we don't know all the reasons why, but it isn't just because they have worse access to health care. And it isn't because they have worse pre-existing conditions. The fourth principle is that even short-term air pollution matters. Even 1 day of increased air pollution will be followed by increased levels of mortality in the community that go on for a month. Other studies, in fact, confirm the same sort of principle. Now I'm going to apologize for the noise on this second one, or excuse me, this number 5. Averages don't tell the whole story. That's kind of another way of saying what we mentioned in number 4. What you just saw there was a house being destroyed in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma in a matter of seconds. Now, if we were to have measured the 24-hour average of the wind speed at the front door of that house, the average wind speed over that day would have been normal. But within 10 seconds, the house was destroyed by winds of 240 miles per hour. So that illustrates that averages don't tell the whole story, and averages don't tell the whole story on our air pollution. It has been very frustrating to deal with public officials of state agencies and even some federal agencies who want to diminish the impact of our air pollution by saying that our averages really aren't that bad, so people shouldn't be so worried. but averages don't tell the whole story. Related to that is number 6. Timing is critical. An air pollution event that exposes a fetus at 12 weeks gestation has a significantly increased risk to their total lifelong health impacts than an adult exposed to the exact same type and concentration of pollution and exact same duration. So the timing of exposure, depending on what stage of development that person is at, has a tremendous impact on the outcome. And that's also true of other vulnerable subsets of the population, children and the elderly. If an elderly person is on the verge of having a heart attack or a stroke, just one weekend of air pollution or even a few hours of air pollution can make all the difference in whether or not the outcome is tragic. Number 7 is not all particulate air pollution is created equal. Now you can see there are 4 different types. One is cigarette smoke, one is tailpipe emissions from an automobile, another is an industrial smokestack, and another is a wood-burning fireplace. Now we'll talk in just a minute about which of those is the most toxic, but they're not all equally toxic. Unfortunately, they won't be treated differentially by our state and federal regulators, but they're not equally toxic, as we'll talk about right now. And let me elaborate on that further. LeBron James is a basketball player, maybe the world's greatest at the moment. LeBaron James is also a basketball player. He lives in Sandy. He's 10 years old and he shoots baskets in his driveway every weekend in the summer. LeBron James and LeBaron James are both basketball players, but your chance of winning an NBA championship with LeBron James compared to LeBaron James is dramatically different, despite the fact that they're both basketball players. Well, that's also true when it comes to air pollution. If you think about the mass of this brass ball, it's roughly equal to the mass of all these silver balls. But the surface area is dramatically different. Now, the air pollution filters at the DAQ's air pollution monitors will record the mass of the brass ball the same as the mass of all the silver balls. But the surface area of those 2 different entities is dramatically different. And toxicity is proportional to surface area. But that fact will not be taken into account by our federal and state regulators. This is an advertisement that illustrates a little bit of the point, because as you may be hinting to yourself as you're listening to this, maybe the most toxic of those types of particulate air pollution is in fact wood smoke. And here's one of the reasons why.
1 hour of burning wood emits as many deadly chemicals as 6,000 packs of cigarettes. When all that nastiness goes up your chimney, it finds its way back into your own house and the homes of all your neighbors. It's like your whole neighborhood is taking up smoking, including children. Despite these facts, some people get firewood for free. Would you let your children smoke just because cigarettes were free? If you're burning, you're smoking. A message from Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment.
In fact, wood smoke is the most toxic of those types of particulate air pollution because the particles are extremely tiny, the surface area is very large, and there are massive quantities of some of these most toxic chemicals attached to that particulate matter, like PAHs, which we mentioned with barbecuing at the beginning. Microenvironments matter. And that comes into play in things like whether or not your neighbor is going to be burning wood through a fireplace, a wood stove, or a wood boiler. Studies out of California show that in fact, someone who's a house or 2 downwind of someone else burning wood can have 100 times more pollution that they're exposed to than someone, say, a mile away. This is also relevant to issues like environmental justice, because we know that pollution is not evenly disseminated throughout our community. And in fact, in Salt Lake City, we know the West Side is predominantly affected by a lot of the industrial pollution that we all worry about. And with the inland port, we know we are on the verge of creating another significant concentration of new community air pollution. So if we were to summarize the health impacts of air pollution, we could do it fairly easily. They're almost all the same as what we know are related to smoking cigarettes. It includes heart attacks, strokes, acceleration of the aging process, sudden death, cancers, brain diseases, cognitive loss, behavioral disorders, all types of lung diseases, arthritis, impaired fetal development, poor pregnancy outcomes, including birth defects, stillbirths, and premature births, and endocrine disorders. So if I had a live audience, I'd ask them at this point what their favorite organ is. And in part because I get some hilarious answers. And if any guy is bold enough to answer, we know he's lying. So we won't ask any men. But think for a minute, what is your favorite organ? Some of the most common responses are, well, your brain, your heart, your lungs. Some people mention your pancreas. I get a few smart alecks mentioning their appendix. And occasionally somebody gets extra credit for mentioning the adrenal glands. But in fact, my favorite organ, and probably should be your favorite organ, is one that you no longer have. I no longer have. And that is the placenta. Because it is totally dependent on the placenta for normal human development. And if we jeopardize the integrity and the function of the placenta in any way, then we do permanent damage to that person's health, oftentimes for the rest of their life, not to mention whether or not the pregnancy itself is viable. So let's look a little bit about what air pollution does to the placenta. This is an electron micrograph of a human placenta. Those little boxes are surrounding little white arrows. And what those little white arrows are pointing to are air pollution particles embedded in the placenta itself. Now, if we can document, as we have, that air pollution particles contaminate the placenta, we know those particles are making it to the fetus as well. These are electron micrographs of animal placentas. And in box A are animals, in this case, laboratory mice, who become pregnant in filtered air. Probably air comparable to the clean air we had in Salt Lake today. In the panel B are mice that were raised in polluted air, typical of urban Los Angeles, about 3 to 4 times the pollution of the filtered air. And what you're seeing there is greater congestion and smaller blood vessels in the placenta of the animals that were exposed to air pollution. And that becomes manifest by a decrease in the maternal to fetal surface ratios, in this case, a decline of about 20 to 40%. What that means is simply this: the blood supply to the fetus is being compromised. And if the blood supply to the fetus is being compromised, the health of that fetus is being compromised, and there's the potential for lifelong consequences. This is another electron micrograph, even higher power, of a single cell. You can see those red arrows are pointing to literal pollution particles that have embedded themselves within the cell. And in that even higher powered box, they have penetrated the nucleus of the cell, where we know that they can interfere with the functioning of chromosomes. These researchers also performed the same experiment with the mice exposed to air pollution only before the pregnancy, but not during the pregnancy. And they found similar results. In other words, the mice didn't have to even be exposed to the air pollution during the pregnancy. Just prior exposure, prior to conception, had a similar sort of outcome. Now, if your favorite organs are your lungs, here's an example of what air pollution does to your lungs. On the left, or at least my left, your right probably, is a pretty healthy looking lung from a resident who spent his entire life in rural Australia, where the air pollution levels were pretty low. On the other side is a resident of Sydney, Australia, lived there his entire life, exposed to the air pollution typical of Sydney, which is a little less than in Salt Lake City on average. Neither patient smoked. So what you're looking at in that lung that is speckled with black and gray are black carbon air pollution particles that they never exhaled. That's what, unfortunately, an awful lot of adult lungs look like if they come from people who live in Salt Lake City. Let's talk a little bit about lung physiology. The human set of lungs are comprised of about 500 million alveoli, or air sacs. If we were to flatten all those air sacs so that they were like one cell thin, we would have an organ with the surface area of a tennis court. So if we breathe 20 times a minute, think about this. You can be inhaling the amount of air pollution that rests on top of 20 tennis courts every minute. Now, you breathe about 29,000 times during a 24-hour period. So during a 24-hour period, you can be inhaling the amount of air pollution as rests upon the surface of 29,000 tennis courts. Now, if there are any pulmonologists in the audience, you know that that's a little bit of a distortion because with each breath, only about half of our lung exchanges gas with the atmosphere. So we're going to cut that down to 15,000. But in a 24-hour period, you can be inhaling the amount of air pollution that rests on the surface of 15,000 tennis courts. So let's follow a little bit of a journey of a pollution particle once it's inhaled. Up here in the top, a pollution particle gets inhaled by the lungs, travels to one of these alveoli, and then gets picked up by the microcirculation in the lung, then gets delivered to the heart. And from there, it gets delivered to the brain, the kidneys, the liver, and all the critical organs. Let's just talk for a minute about what it does while it's in the lungs. Chronic exposure causes scarring of lung tissue and interstitial lung disease. It increases the bacterial population of the lung. It increases the severity and risk of pneumonia. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think that if now on top of that, someone is exposed to COVID, they are being set up for a worse outcome from COVID, increased in their risk of fatality. And that's not only the baseline chronic exposure to air pollution, but if we have another winter inversion air pollution event on top of that, then all of that physiologic disadvantage is exacerbated. That's why numerous studies now have shown that people exposed to more air pollution actually have higher risks of death and poor outcomes from COVID. Add to that the fact that, COVID is also, if not even more than a lung disease, it's also a blood vessel disease. And because of what we're going to talk about in just a minute, it increases the risk of the blood vessel component of COVID. Air pollution exacerbates virtually all pulmonary diseases and likely plays a causative role in reactive airways disease, which is our fancy word for asthma. And this one study is very chilling. Researchers followed 7,000 people over 18 to 19 years. And they were able to document the change in their lung function over that time through CAT scans and through spirometry. And they found this striking correlation. Just 3 parts per billion increase in ozone over 10 years was associated with as much lung tissue loss and loss of lung function as you would see from smoking a pack a day for 29 years. Now, to put 3 parts per billion ozone in context, the EPA's threshold for an acceptable level of ozone is not 3, but 70. Air pollution permanently inhibits lung growth in children. In fact, prenatal exposure can reduce fetal lung development, impairing lung function not only in childhood, but throughout life. This study took advantage of the premier air pollution event of Western civilization, if you want to call it that, the Great London Smog Event of 1952. It lasted for only 4 days. It was probably involved about 3 times as much air pollution as what we might experience on one of our worst air or winter inversion days. Researchers then looked up these people that were either in utero in 1952 or in their first year of life. And they looked at their lung function and found that 60 plus years later, these people had diminished lung function and increased susceptibility to lung disease. And remember, that was only from 1 weekend of air pollution. We know that you can actually absorb air pollution that bypasses your lungs. It can attach itself to the mucosa of the lining of your nose, which then attaches to the nerves in your nose, the olfactory nerves, and acts like a conveyor belt, delivering air pollution particles directly to the brainstem. That's one of the ways that our brains get contaminated by air pollution. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. I don't imagine any of you know what this is. I'll let you guess for about 10 seconds or 2 seconds. While I take a sip of water. This is a human skin pore. You have about 5 million of them. And that's one of the reasons why you can absorb pollution from your skin. It's not the only one, but with 5 million of those, you can absorb a lot of pollution, as was documented by this experiment and many others, where researchers blocked the ability of patients to inhale air pollution or absorb air pollution through their nose. And they found out they absorbed so much air pollution through their skin, they made this comment. If a chemical is toxic through ingestion or inhalation, it will also be toxic through absorption. You'll be happy to know that scholars are taking a new look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I alluded to my disdain for the ubiquitous drug company ads earlier. Scholars have recently taken a closer look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and found evidence of drug company ads dating back to 33 AD. I've heard that if your resurrection lasts longer than 4 hours, you should call your doctor immediately. I'm sure I offended some more people with that one. Now let's talk about how air pollution affects your heart and your blood vessels. If everyone starts breathing a little more air pollution, within about 15 to 30 minutes, we can document a little bit of a rise in your blood pressure, a little bit of rise in heart rate, and an increase in inflammation and narrowing of the arteries. And in fact, we can measure in the blood and the urine within 15 minutes those air pollution particles. And we know that they preferentially accumulate in the sites of your blood vessels where inflammation and atherosclerosis has already developed. In other words, the pollution particles preferentially go to the worst possible places. And in this particular study, the researchers found they could still measure those pollution particles in the body 3 months later. So in addition to causing trouble with blood vessels, what it does is it increases the risk of myocardial infarction, which is our fancy word for a heart attack. It impairs the heart pumping mechanism for multiple reasons, but one of which that means the heart has to pump harder against higher blood pressure. That aggravates your susceptibility to congestive heart failure, as well as your chance of having arrhythmias. Now, the heart is one muscle where bigger is not better. And this particular study showed in healthy 60-year-olds that a little bit more air pollution was associated with a 10% increase in the size of their heart chambers. And again, an increase in size of heart chambers is not an indication of health. It's in fact an indication of the opposite. And this is one of the most chilling studies. This was an autopsy study done of victims from early childhood to middle-aged adults. And the researchers found in every single patient somewhere between 2 billion and 22 billion nanoparticles of pollution embedded in every heart per gram of heart tissue. And if that's not bad enough, it actually gets a little bit worse. Researchers found for this experiment in mice that preconception exposure to air pollution actually causes dysfunction in heart formation. Our fancy word for that is cardiomyopathy, and the increase in LVEDP is an expression of the fact that the hearts actually mechanically performed worse than they should and had a decreased ejection fraction, which is an expression of how much blood the heart is able to eject. Now, if your favorite organ was the brain, then certainly you're definitely not one of these guys. And also not one of these guys. And you're certainly not this guy. But a lot of people mention that their brain is their favorite organ, and I have no argument with that at all. Air pollution causes brain pollution. This is looking over Salt Lake City at one of our refineries in North Salt Lake. And this is the cover of a recent Science magazine that said basically the polluted brain is much worse than what we realized. And in fact, evidence is building that pollution causes Alzheimer's, dementia, and other studies which suggest that about 20% of Alzheimer's dementia can be attributable to air pollution. But it's actually worse than that, because hundreds of toxic substances now have been documented to cross the placenta and enter the brain, enter the fetus. And so we now know that actually babies are born, including their brains, pre-polluted. In this particular study, researchers tracked about 400 chemicals, and they detected 287 of them in the umbilical cord, 217 of which were known to be toxic to the brain and the nervous system. And the real number is likely in the thousands, because they really only tested for about 400 of them. Basically, the greater the contamination of our environment, including the air we breathe, the greater will be irreversible risk of harm to a developing brain. Now, during the fetal stages of development, the brain is uniquely vulnerable. About 250,000 brain cells are being added every minute to fetal development, reaching a total of about 100 to 200 billion brain cells total at the time of birth. If there are environmental toxic exposures during that time, which cross the placenta and the umbilical cord and enter the amniotic fluid and the fetus, we know that normal brain development will be impacted. And in fact, clinical studies confirm that very fact. Researchers out of UCLA documented the amount of PAH exposure of pregnant mothers, and then 7 to 8 years later, examined what the consequences might have been to their children. And they found a direct linear relationship between the amount of PAH exposure to the pregnant mothers and the loss of brain white matter in their children, documented by brain scans. And the loss of white matter correlated with the loss of intelligence and behavioral disorders. Now, this is a brain scan where the gray matter has been digitally subtracted. And what you're seeing there is a fairly normal volume of white brain matter on the right. But on the left, all that purple area represents an abnormal loss of brain white matter. And we don't know why most of the loss occurs on the left hemisphere, but nonetheless it does. And it correlates linearly with the amount of PAH air pollution exposure that these mothers experienced during the pregnancy. Again, autopsy studies of the brain. Researchers found, in fact, millions of pollution nanoparticles in the brains of every single person that they autopsied in ages from 3 to 90, millions of particles per gram of brain tissue. And in fact, in some of the brains, 1/100th of the weight of the brain was these magnetite particles, which are metal particles created by combustion of fossil fuels. It's little wonder then that 1 microgram per cubic meter of PM 2.5, and that's, I'm guessing, given the air pollution that Salt Lake City experienced today, which is very low, I'm guessing that was 1 microgram is about, I'd say 1/6 of what it was probably in Salt Lake Valley today, 1 microgram of PM 2.5 was the equivalent of about 2.7 years worth of accelerated aging of the brain. Numerous studies show that, in fact, acute exposure to air pollution causes fairly quick, if not instantaneous, inflammation of the brain. In fact, if you put somebody on a diesel bus and then they arrive at their destination, like school, we can put an EEG monitor on that person and document brain inflammation from 45 minutes worth of exposure to diesel exhaust. And then a different type of experiment, very similar, however, showed that even in an area where air pollution levels are chronically low, you put an air purifier in a classroom, it improves children's test scores more than if you reduce class size by 30%, because the children have cleaner air to breathe, their baseline level of inflammation is less, and they can learn better, they can memorize better, they can think better. Okay, now all that's a little bit depressing, so here's here's a little bit of a joke for you. The average Utahn walks 900 miles per year and drinks 22 gallons of beer. Now that doesn't apply to this audience, obviously, being the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. But the end result is the average Utahn gets 41 miles per gallon, which is pretty good. If everybody got 41 miles per gallon, we'd have a lot less air pollution. Air pollution is also, now, if you were one of those people that thought your favorite organ was your pancreas, then air pollution has a gift for you as well. Air pollution increases a person's risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity. There are now about 60 to 70 studies that have documented that significant correlation. Just about every type of cancer is correlated with the amount of air pollution that a person breathes, including the most common types of air pollution in men, or excuse me, the most common types of cancer in men and women, which is prostate cancer and breast cancer. And we have numerous studies that show your chance of surviving cancer is also related to the amount of air pollution that you breathe. Now, if your favorite biological feature is not any of your organs per se, but instead your chromosomes, then air pollution also has a lot to say about that. If a mother is pregnant and that fetus is also female, then one air pollution exposure can expose 3 generations at once: the mother, the fetus, and because if the fetus is female, the fetus is also developing eggs. One exposure alone can infect the health of 3 generations. So that maternal exposure to air pollution actually programs a mother's daughter and her granddaughter to a shorter lifespan. And in fact, if we extrapolate from studies on invertebrates, this same epigenetic and genetic alteration can persist for up to 11 generations. In other words, multiple generations are being affected by the air pollution that we are emitting today. Now, we've all experienced the impact of these horrible California wildfires. The official death toll of these wildfires, I think, ultimately reached 46. But the unofficial, but far more realistic death toll was that from the air pollution alone, we estimate that well over 3,000 people died from the air pollution of all these wildfire events just this year. In fact, most of it the late summer and fall. We have reached a point in our environmental apocalypse that now half of the annually generated air pollution in the Western United States comes from wildfires. This is what San Francisco and much of the West Coast looked like for weeks at a time last summer. And this is a scene from Blade Runner. Now, I don't think you could really tell the difference if it wasn't for the car in the foreground. I want to take a step back for a minute and take another look at this from a broader perspective. I was a little bit hopeful in 2014 after we organized the largest anti-air pollution rally in the modern history of the country, if only because it may have been the first anti-air pollution rally in the country. But powerful forces in the state legislature were only willing to nibble around the edges. And we have accomplished really very little. Overall, our air pollution is a little cleaner, or air quality is a little cleaner than it was in 2014. But the main reason is that our inversions are a little less intense, and that's primarily because our winter inversions are less, our snowpack is less. In other words, our air pollution being a little bit improved in the winter is the result of the climate crisis. However, the climate crisis is also increasing ozone concentrations worldwide because formation of ozone in the atmosphere is the result of a chemical reaction catalyzed by heat. So the hotter the planet gets overall, the more ozone will be dispersed globally. And because of increased wildfire pollution that we just mentioned, we're going to have increased particulate pollution in the summer, which is exactly what we have been experiencing. And since then, with the inland port, the legislature is poised to make things even worse. So if we're going to solve Salt Lake City's air pollution problem, we need to step back much further. We're not going to solve our air pollution problems unless we address the climate crisis. Granted, after the past election, things look a little bit more hopeful. But that problem is much more entrenched than just a little less dirty energy and a few more windmills and solar panels. The UN released this statement 2 days ago. Humans are making Earth a broken planet, increasingly unlivable through climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. The world must make dramatic changes to society, economics, and daily life. And my postscript to that is, our environmental crisis is a manifestation of a much broader morality crisis. We'll have to develop an attitude of shared sacrifice far beyond what we have ever done in the past and far beyond what we are doing now. This is a picture of 10,000 cars lined up at a San Antonio food bank last summer. America has the largest homeless population and more hunger and more poverty than any developed country. And yet we also have this. The 3 richest Americans have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country. We have institutionalized the immorality of poverty, suffering, and inequality, all of which will only become much worse with the climate crisis. Much of the reason why there are thousands of people at our southern border is because of the climate crisis, for which we are largely responsible. The climate crisis has so badly damaged agriculture in Central America that people can no longer feed themselves and they have nowhere else to turn. And yet we have done this to them. We have institutionalized the immorality of cruelty on a mass scale. We have institutionalized idiocy, a world where there are no empirical facts, where science and reality are smothered by greed and cultural and racial grievances. Nearly on a scale of Nazi Germany, we have institutionalized not just extreme opinions, but outright propaganda and deceit, by which, by the way, has only gotten worse since the election. 500,000 Americans have died from COVID already, far more than in World War II. And by the way, viral pandemics are directly related to the climate crisis and our disruption and disintegration of the natural world. So COVID is likely to be followed by many more pandemics in the future. New research indicates that public policy similar to what other countries did and simple wearing of masks would have saved 200,000 of those lives. Yet in Utah, we had widespread defiance and refusal to adopt the simple sacrifice of wearing a mask. We have institutionalized devaluing of human life. Many of the same people who beat their chests about being pro-life are revealing that they are really only pro their own life and their own convenience. But there are already hundreds of thousands of climate refugees throughout the world, and that will turn into millions and eventually billions if we don't change. People like this and like this are the victims of the climate crisis and every bit as much the morality crisis. But so are these victims in our own country. These are people in Texas. I have two sons who live in Texas, where this has been going on for a week. They have lost heat and water and they've had broken pipes, and they've suffered a lot less than a lot of people. People like 11-year-old Christian Pineda, who froze to death in an unheated mobile home. Count him as an American climate refugee. This is also part of the morality crisis, that we should allow this kind of damage to the brains of our children, but especially poor children, including the poor children on the west side that will be inhaling the pollution from the inland port. And this is part of the morality crisis. Placentas that are unhealthy, and because of the pollution allowed, will affect the lifelong health of everyone so victimized, every single newborn. In 2020, we spent weeks tasting the dystopian future of Blade Runner, but we narrowly missed descending into a permanent dystopian planet of the apes, which many Americans still long for, and some remain determined to impose upon us. If we're going to behave like a different species, it better be the emperor penguins of Antarctica. They survive the coldest temperatures on the planet, not because a few of them fly to Cancun, but because they can work for the common good, and they do work for the common good. They huddle together and not just keep each other warm, they allow each member to go from outside of the huddle to the inside and back and forth, so none of them get overheated and none of them freeze to death. Some might call it penguin socialism. Frankly, I'm ashamed to be of the same species as the mayor of this Texas town, who said this week, "No one owes you or your family anything, nor is it the local government's responsibility to support you in these trying times like this. Sink or swim, it's your choice. The city and county and the power providers, no service providers, owe you anything. I'm tired of people looking for a handout. Only the strong will survive and the weak will perish." Speaking of sinking or swimming, I'm proud to be of the same species as this 11-year-old boy, Anthony Perez, who also died on the same day as Christian Pineda, but in a much different way. He was walking on a frozen pond in New York, and his 12-year-old friend fell in and couldn't get out. Anthony rescued his friend, but he couldn't save himself. Now, because this is a faith-based group, perhaps I can close by invoking a thought from the New Testament. Jesus admonished us to become like little children. I think Anthony is what he was talking about. Now, I don't know if I've motivated you to become part of the battle to save the world or depressed into thinking there's no hope. But if you want more information to do either one, you can read much more about it in one of my books. Death by Corporation is published. I hope to publish the next one in about a month. Thank you for having me. And then if there are any questions, I'd be certainly happy to try and entertain them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moench. That was certainly thought-provoking and very sobering in a lot of ways, and I really appreciate you connecting those dots for us. We only have a few minutes left, so but we do have a couple of questions. One is that the question, how can we support lower income families in transitioning away from wood burning and other polluting sources of heating? It speaks to the climate justice that you were speaking of earlier?
Well, Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment has actually partnered with the EPA in a grant to help people, in this case in Summit County, transition from wood burning stoves to something cleaner. Now, if you don't live in Summit County, the state actually started sponsoring a program similar to that. And let me get rid of that slide. So the state has actually been doing that, but unfortunately, the state found after doing this, I think for about a year to 2 years, that there weren't enough takers. And so they may have suspended the program. But that sort of program was thought about by both the state agency and the federal agency. So there were programs developed, and there is still one in Summit County with the help of the federal government. Now, if for some reason you live outside of the geographical area where that help might be available, I might add this. I would think everybody understands that their own health has economic consequences. There is no question that families that burn wood for heat are subjecting themselves to significantly higher levels of air pollution, such that there's no question that short-term, but most certainly long-term, their own health will suffer significantly because of that. So to whatever extent a family like that can, with the help of any government agency or not, muster up a cleaner source of heat, it's certainly to their long-term, if not their short-term advantage to do so.